Well, good evening, and as you might be able to tell, I'm a little bit less animated, vocally speaking, than I might otherwise be. I would probably have done this without a amplification, normally speaking, but as you can tell, not everybody would be able to hear. In fact, probably the front row would struggle to hear if I was not speaking without the benefit of a loudspeaker. So first of all, thank you so much. And by the way, is this actually audible too at the back as well? Yeah. Firstly, thank you very much to Brighton PSC for the invitation to come and share with you the main arguments and ideas that are in my latest book. And thank you to everybody here who's made time on a Tuesday evening to come and listen to me talk. And as Anne mentioned, there will of course be the time for a Q&A and a discussion after I've spoken, and assuming that I'll be able to provide answers too. So anything that I don't talk about that you'd like to raise, please remember that, or anything that you want me to clarify or expand on, of course, please remember that too. So this new book is called Cracks in the Wall: Beyond Apartheid in Palestine, Israel. And the book has got three main stages of its argument, and that's what I'm going to try and summarize here this evening. The three stages of the book's argument are as follows. The first part of the book takes a hard but realistic look at what the reality on the ground is today in historic Palestine, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and concludes that what exists there now, and has existed there for a long time, is a de facto single apartheid state between the river and the sea. And I'll say a little bit about how that process has unfolded, and why there is no prospect of any meaningful or substantial progress on the political or diplomatic levels in the short or perhaps even medium term. The second part of the book, and that's kind of the grim but necessary part, the second part of the book is about the cracks in the wall, which is in the title. And those cracks in the wall are developments internationally, especially in the US, that I and other people believe that over time these developments can threaten Israel's ability to maintain the apartheid status quo. And so I'm going to unpack a little bit about what those cracks in the wall are. And the third part of the argument of the book, and what I'll sort of come to at the end here this evening, is a look forward and an argument for, sort of in summary, an argument that the only conceivable and best way forward is the transformation of the de facto single apartheid state that exists today into a single democratic state in the future. So that's where we're going. That's sort of the main points. And I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about what exists on the ground today and how we got there. I'm going to begin that part by reading a little bit from the book, which I'll do on a couple of occasions. Chapter 1 of the book is called Reality Check: Palestine, Israel is already a single apartheid state. It was 4:30 a.m. on the 27th of July, 2010, when 1,300 armed Israeli police officers descended upon Al-Araqib, a small, impoverished Bedouin Palestinian village in the Naqab or Negev region of southern Israel. After blocking the entrance to the village, Israeli forces, including mounted cavalry, bulldozers and helicopters, forcibly removed residents from their homes, including children and elderly people. By the end of the raid, the Israeli authorities had destroyed some 45 homes, leaving more than 300 people homeless, half of them children under 16 years old. The bulldozers did not spare animal pens and chicken coops, and hundreds of trees were uprooted for replanting elsewhere. It'll be a bit hard sometimes for me to do ironic quotation marks, but you'll get the idea. Just 2 days before the pre-dawn raid on Al-Aqib, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told government colleagues that a Negev, quote, without a Jewish majority could constitute a palpable threat to the state. Just a few days before the bulldozers went to work in Al-Aqib, a similar scene had played out in the West Bank, as Israeli authorities tore down Palestinian homes en masse in Al-Farasiyah, a herding community in the northern Jordan Valley. On the 19th of July, Israeli forces invaded the village and destroyed more than 70 structures in one fell swoop, including homes, stables, sheds, water tanks, 2 tons of animal fodder, fertilizer and wheat. Israeli authorities also targeted 8 kitchens and 10 bathrooms. The piles of rubble and twisted metal left in Al-Aqib and Al-Farasiyah over a few days in the summer of 2010 were a microcosm of the grim reality that has taken shape in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. For both Palestinian citizens in the Negev and Palestinians in the West Bank, under military rule, Israeli authorities carry out displacement and dispossession with a rubber stamp of due process. The green line, the post-1949 armistice line that distinguishes between territory held by Israel before and after 1967, has been erased in practical terms. The reality on the ground is that of a single regime. In this territorial unit, Palestinians are subjected to institutionalized discrimination, whether they have Israeli citizenship or are under military occupation. And note the similarities between the events and their context in Al-Aqib and Al-Farasiyah. Indigenous Palestinian communities struggle for their very survival thanks to a legal system and bureaucratic apparatus shaped by Israel's explicitly discriminatory political priorities. Jewish homes are built, Palestinian homes are torn down. So that was how I began chapter 1, and a way of helping people to understand the nature and reality of this de facto single state. I'm not sure for everybody in the room where you're coming from tonight in terms of knowledge about or experiences about what's happening there, but I'll just flesh that out very, very briefly with a quick overview. In the occupied West Bank, the Palestinian population is under Israeli military rule. Their lives are dominated by the existence of more than 200 illegal Israeli settlements or colonies that are dotted across the West Bank. That includes 120, 130 or so-called official Israeli government-sanctioned settlements, plus another 100 or so unofficial settlement outposts that have also been established with Israeli authorities' assistance. As settlements expand, Palestinian homes are demolished, and Palestinian homes are demolished under the pretext normally that they do not have the permit from the Israeli occupation authorities that is required to build. But as numerous studies have shown, such as one that looked at the periods 2009 to 2013, 4-year period, 2% of permits were granted to Palestinians who were applying for building. So in other words, Israel has set up a system that is designed to fail the occupied population that in theory the authorities are meant to be serving. In East Jerusalem, which from Israel's point of view is de jure annexed, again illegally and unilaterally, Palestinian residents face similar discriminatory realities based on the presence of settlements, on exclusion from land and so on, as well as home demolitions. Now the Gaza Strip, which from the point of view of international law is part of the occupied Palestinian territory, from the point of view of historic Palestine, has become a way for Israel to literally fence off some 2 million Palestinians, so-called quote-unquote demographic threat. For Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, Israeli apartheid is at its most brutal, under blockade of course, but also subjected to periodic and devastating military offensives. And as we've seen this year, it's not just in the context of large-scale quote-unquote operations that Palestinians are killed in Gaza. We've also seen this year well-armed and well-defended Israeli snipers line up the other side of a secure militarized fence and shoot Palestinian demonstrators, including children, dead, who are posing no threat. Palestinian citizens of Israel, those Palestinians who live inside the pre-67 lines, also face institutionalized discrimination, as the example that I read demonstrates in the case of al-Aqib. But this is discrimination experienced in a whole host of areas of life, from where you can live and where you can't live, more importantly, to budgets for education and culture, to political expression, to the ability to bring a spouse of your choosing to come and live with you in the country, and so on, and more besides. This is just skimming the surface. The point that I want to emphasize is that the Israeli authorities are pursuing the same overall strategic goals across all of this de facto single state. Okay? And that reality is starting to be acknowledged in let's say, mainstream contexts as well. Okay? For example, a Human Rights Watch report, I think it was from last year, wrote, in both the Negev and the West Bank, Israeli authorities apply zoning laws in a discriminatory manner. Now, as I was writing this book, I wanted to give a sense of how and why Israel was able to de facto annex the West Bank over the last half a century plus. And one of the things that you're struck by when you look into this is the repetition over and over again of a certain kind of warning. And it's a warning that I'm sure a lot of people in this room will be familiar with. The warning goes something like this. The window is closing on the potential for a two-state solution. The door is closing on the ability for a Palestinian state to be established in the occupied territories, and so on. Now, this door and window that is closing, always closing, and never shut, is normally a figure of speech that is used in relation to the Israeli settlements, their number, their size, their population, and so forth, right? So it would be like, okay, now there's 100,000, now there's 300,000, now there's 500,000 settlers, and so on. So, to give you an indication of how this has been just repeated over and over through the years, through the decades, here's an example. Meron Ben-Venisti, former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, was speaking to an American audience in DC, and he warned the audience that in his language, it was 5 minutes to midnight in terms of preventing an irreversible Israeli hold on the West Bank. 5 minutes to midnight. And he said that in 1982. Okay? That's when he made those remarks to the American audience. Okay? Now, in my opinion, the idea of a particular cut-off point or a point of no return that is based on the size or number of the settlements and their population can obscure more than it illuminates in terms of what we're trying to understand as going on here, politically speaking. Around the same time that Meron Ben-Venisti made those remarks to an American audience, an American professor of Middle East Studies called Ian Lustig was writing a research paper for the American government, actually, for the Defense Department. And he was asked to examine the question, again, of the supposed or potential irreversibility of Israel's hold of the occupied Palestinian territories. And what Ian Lustig suggested was that rather than look at numbers of settlements and population, it's better to consider two different kinds of threshold. And he talked about an institutional threshold and a cultural threshold. And by that, paraphrasing, summarizing, what he meant by that was the institutional threshold is to what extent Israeli state bodies and Israeli institutions treat and consider the West Bank in particular as quote-unquote part of Israel, or the majority of it. And the psychocultural threshold that Ian Lustig was talking about was to what extent Jewish Israelis, or most of them, again, view or consider the West Bank to be quote-unquote part of Israel. And in the early mid-80s, Ian Lustig thought, okay, you could argue it both ways, whether those thresholds have been crossed. In 2018, I think it's safe to say that both of those thresholds have been crossed. Now, potentially counterintuitively, Israel's de facto annexation of the West Bank has been aided by the fact that until now, it hasn't been a de jure annexation. Why? Because for more than 50 years, the Israeli occupation authorities in the West Bank have enjoyed and used the powers of a sovereign, while the Palestinian residents do not have the rights of citizens. So this has been, deliberate strategic decisions so far for 50 plus years by successive Israeli governments not to de jure annex the West Bank, but actually that itself has been key in aiding Israeli colonization of the West Bank. And another factor that has facilitated Israeli de facto annexation of the West Bank has been the official peace process, by which I mean a quarter century long, more or less, of international, mainly US, supervised talks, public and private, between Israel and the PLO. Now, why has the peace process helped Israel's de facto annexation? Because by being based around and promulgating the idea that Israel's presence in the occupied territories, in the West Bank in particular, is temporary, it has kept politicians and diplomats from denouncing the apartheid reality that already exists. So even someone like Boris Johnson, a couple of years ago, on a visit to the region, when he was then the Foreign Secretary, he said something to the effect of, without a two-state solution, without a Palestinian state, this will be an apartheid situation here. Okay? And John Kerry, when he still was Secretary of State, US Secretary of State, said something very similar. Okay, without a two-state solution, this will be an apartheid situation. And even someone like Ehud Barak, a former Israeli Prime Minister, has said something very similar and used the A word, the apartheid word. But here's the thing. They're all talking about a hypothetical situation that has existed for decades. Okay? The language that's used is, if Israel maintained control over millions of Palestinians who haven't got citizenship and can't vote in the only parliament that counts, that will be an apartheid situation. But 1967 wasn't yesterday. Okay? So with respect to Israel's hold of the West Bank, this has not been an overnight process. But by keeping the idea that Israel's presence is temporary, it has actually aided all the ways in which Israel has made sure that it is permanent, its presence in the West Bank. Now, before I come on to talking about the cracks in the wall, I also wanted just to say something about the impasse in the so-called peace process. And if you're ever looking to explain to somebody why various attempts at talks, peace talks, have failed, yeah, you can get into a lot of detail, but there's one basic truth at the heart of all of it, and that is this: the Israeli maximum on offer has never come close to the minimum that Palestinians can accept, or the standards of international law. That's it. And that applies no matter who's been offering, whether it's Olmert or Rabin. Daniel Levy is an individual who used to advise the Israeli negotiators in the 90s. I think it was last year, he was speaking to me for an article I wrote for Al Jazeera, and he was talking about the negotiation process and all the effort that is put into trying to make it look like a quote-unquote two-state solution is possible. And he said this: creative solutions can't paper over a gap that is so huge because one side, Israel, simply does not accept the legitimacy of the independent, sovereign existence of the other. Today, there's only really three broad categories of offer on the table from the mainstream Israeli political spectrum with respect to the Palestinians. Those three offers, what's on the table, are as follows. The status quo, which is an apartheid status quo, and that's, I think, Netanyahu's quite fond of the status quo. From his point of view, it's low risk, a lot of advantages and so forth. Then you've got people who are advocating for total or partial formal annexation of the West Bank. And that point of view is represented in the current Israeli government, not only by the Jewish Home Party, but also within the ruling Likud party too. And then you have the third option on the table, which is mainly represented within the Israeli opposition parties and the current Knesset, and that is the option of quote-unquote separation. Now, that's often branded or marketed as a quote two-state solution approach, but it's not. Not if you mean a genuinely independent, sovereign Palestinian state. The Zionist camp, dominated by the Israeli Labour Party, Yesh Atid, another so-called centrist party, they push a platform of separation from the Palestinians, not because they recognize the legitimacy of Palestinian self-determination, but because they are seeking a solution, in their view, to the demographic threat posed by the existence of Palestinians in Palestine. And therefore separation is the particular approach that they're taking, the creation of Palestinian entities that are less than a state. So that's it. You've got status quo, annexation, or separation. And that's it. Now, that's all pretty grim stuff, but I think it's a fair reflection. And as I said, I was only really sort of going over the surface of some of that stuff. But the second part of the book changes focus and looks at what I describe as cracks in the wall. And there's three international developments that I chose to look at. And like I say, they are, some of them are more significant in the US, or at least particularly sort of evident in the US, but they're applicable wider than, in a broader geographic area than the US. And I hope you'll see the argument for their significance. So the three cracks in the wall that I'll talk a little bit about are, number one, the growing support for Palestinian rights and opposition to Israeli policies and even Zionism itself amongst Jewish Americans, especially young Jewish Americans, but not exclusively. Secondly, the way in which Israel has become, or is becoming, a partisan issue within US politics, which speaks to a broader polarization that is also taking place in Europe, where Israel and support for Israel is increasingly associated with the right or even far right, and not just the left, but even liberals and centrists are increasingly alienated from Israel. And the third crack in the wall is the boycott, divestment and sanctions, or BDS campaign. So I'm going to speak a little bit about those three cracks in the wall. So that first one that I talked about, and these are developments that have been going on for a long time, and there are elements involved that are not about Israel or Palestine, actually, but the fragmentation within the American Jewish community over what it means to support Israel, what it means to sort of reckon with what the Israeli authorities are doing on a day-to-day basis and so on and so on. This is a process that is very visible in a number of different ways, and I don't think is a reversible process either. There are a lot of polls you can get into, which is one way of looking at it, but I just wanted to mention, for now, two examples, let's say sort of institutional examples, of this trend. The first example is J Street, which is a Washington, D.C. Beltway-focused lobby group. Now, J Street defines itself as a liberal Zionist organization. It does its advocacy often in the name of protecting or defending Israel's right to be a quote-unquote Jewish state. Its politics are quite similar to the politics represented by that pro-separation camp that I mentioned in Israeli politics. But for all its sort of anti-Palestinian elements, if you can put it like that, the existence or the emergence of J Street is itself an interesting and noteworthy development, because it's positioning itself primarily as a counterweight to AIPAC. And it is a manifestation of aspects of this fragmentation at a kind of quite elite institutional level. Now, a very different kind of example is that provided by Jewish Voice for Peace, which has grown phenomenally over the last few years, is much more, or it does do congressional lobbying, but is much more of a grassroots, activist-based organization, membership organization. It exists in dozens of US states, works locally and nationally. JVP supports the Palestinian-led Bds Campaign. JVP's membership has attracted youth, but it's not exclusive. And sometimes someone starts off in J Street and ends up getting radicalized into JVP. So these are some manifestations of what's going on. Another example you could look at again is the Bernie Sanders campaign. For the last time there was a Democratic leadership contest. He might of course run again, but all the politics around Bernie Sanders has a very different tone and message on Israel and the Palestinians to previous incarnations of the Democratic Party, right? Again, of course, he's got a long way to go still with respect to his stance on BDS and other elements, but it is still a significant development. Okay, it's not his tweets, for example, on the atrocities that Israeli forces have been committing in Gaza are not the type of tweets that high-profile, high-ranking Democrat politicians would have been doing not all that long ago. I'm just going to give you a quick example of this polarization. So I've sort of skipped to the second aspect of that. With the Bernie Sanders example kind of bridges these two examples, really. Just find my bit with the use of one hand. Yeah, so Bernie Sanders' candidacy sort of bridges this one crack in the wall, which is to do with the fragmentation in the American Jewish community, and the way in which Israel-Palestine is becoming a polarizing issue in US politics, right? Which the smarter Israeli officials and pro-Israel advocates are aware of and are very worried about. So here's an example of this phenomenon. In 2017, YouGov published the results of a national poll of US adults, and the question that was asked was, they were asking American adults to rank a list of countries on a scale of ally or enemy. Right? Now, when those results were published, it was on a 5-point scale. Israel had dropped to 16th place from 6th in 2014. So over 3 years, Israel had dropped from 6th to 16th. Significant enough. But even more striking was the disparity between Republicans and Democrats, who placed Israel 5th and 28th, respectively. Okay, so Republican voting US adults ranked Israel as the US's 5th most important ally, and Democrats ranked Israel 28th. Right? There's a lot of polls that you can get into with respect to this phenomenon. As I was writing this book, sorry, 1 second. As I was writing this book, a episode unfolded that to my mind was very instructive for the way in which it encapsulated and embodied these different cracks in the wall. The fragmentation in the American Jewish community, the polarization in mainstream US politics over Israel. And the third crack in the wall, which I'm about to come to. But this example, this story that unfolded, was Donald Trump's decision to nominate David Friedman as US ambassador to Israel, which he duly became. But his Senate confirmation hearing was really quite an extraordinary affair. And it's actually in the introduction to my book that I talk about it. It was a Senate hearing like no other. David Friedman, US President Donald Trump's nominee for the position of ambassador to Israel, had been speaking for about 20 seconds when he was loudly interrupted by a man holding a Palestinian flag. Now, if I'm reading this normally, I sort of semi-shout this part, but you can imagine it. Mr. Friedman also said that Palestinian refugees don't have a claim to the land, don't have a connection to Palestine, the man shouted. My grandfather was exiled, was kicked out by the State of Israel. As he was led out by police officers, Taha Herz-Allah of American Muslims for Palestine managed one last parting shot. We aren't going away, Mr. Friedman. We were there, we are there now, and we will always be there. Palestinians will always be in Palestine. After an awkward silence, and it is pretty awkward, you can watch this entire sort of process unfold on YouTube if you look it up. After an awkward silence, Friedman resumed. But this was just the first of a series of interruptions. 2 minutes later, fellow American Muslims for Palestine staffer Karim al-Husseini stood up and protested Friedman's support for Israel's illegal settlements in the West Bank. Waving a Palestinian flag, al-Husseini was also removed and arrested. Before Friedman could get to the end of his opening statement, he was subjected to an equally dramatic interruption by 3 members of If Not Now, a group started in 2014 by young Jewish Americans in the context of Operation Protective Edge. You promote racism, fund illegal settlements, one man shouted. We will not be silenced. You do not represent us, and you will never represent us. Another activist stood and stated loudly, Israeli occupation is an injustice against Palestinians and a moral crisis for American Jews. Moral American Jews stand against occupation and against Friedman. Now, Friedman was ultimately confirmed, but that journey and that process was a battle. There were communal American Jewish organizations who declared in support, explicitly in support of Friedman's nomination. There were those who sort of didn't say anything at all, kind of neutral, and there were those who actively campaigned against it. And when he was eventually confirmed, it was split down the middle between Republicans and Democrats. Remember that the confirmation of ambassador is typically a procedural question, right? But this was an appointment that was sort of heaving with politics and with divisive politics. Now, the interruptions that happened from the young Palestinian Americans leads me to the third crack in the wall after the developments in the American Jewish community and the polarization issue. The third crack in the wall, which is the BDS campaign, the global civil society-based campaign to boycott and isolate Israel. Now, again, I don't know how many people in here are familiar or not familiar with the BDS campaign. I will sort of give the main headlines, as it were, for the benefit of anybody in here who's not familiar. The BDS campaign was initiated properly in 2005 by a wide coalition of Palestinian civil society groups. The call is, the idea of it's very simple. The idea is that people of good conscience around the world can partake in a civil society-based campaign of pressure designed to hold Israel to account. And the BDS campaign has got 3 elements of what Palestinian groups are calling for, which is an end to Israeli occupation and the dismantling of the apartheid wall, equality for all, and an end to the systematic discrimination faced by Palestinians inside 67 lines, and the right of return and compensation to be implemented for the Palestinian refugees. All rights, by the way, which you can find good grounds for and are contextualized with in terms of international legal frameworks and human rights and so forth. Now, since that call was made 13 years ago, it's genuinely become a global movement, and it's had take-up in a wide variety of civil society sectors, from university campuses and student movements through to cultural workers, artists respecting the call for the cultural boycott, academics, through to local communities simply getting behind particular specific campaign calls or campaign issues pertaining to procurement or divestment and so forth. Now, as that has grown, as that BDS campaign has grown, a campaign which educates and mobilizes Israeli authorities have woken up to the extent to which it's a threat to their ability to maintain the status quo. And in the last few years have begun to mobilize reasonably significant resources to try and undermine the Bds campaign and Palestine solidarity activism more generally. That's been done through a number of means, but at the discursive and rhetorical level, Bds campaigners and the boycott is smeared or tarnished as quote-unquote extremist or quote-unquote anti-Semitic. I'm not going to say too much more about BDS right now. I'm going to leave it in case people want to talk about it in the Q&A. Obviously, suffice to say, I personally am a wholehearted supporter of it, and as I've watched it sort of unfold over the years, I think what Israel hates about it the most is that it threatens impunity, is that it's a threat to impunity, and a serial violator of basic norms. An apartheid state is threatened by accountability and the end to impunity. And that to me is exactly what the problem, as it were, from Israel's point of view is with BDS. Now just before I go towards some concluding remarks, it's worth mentioning that the Trump presidency is already acting in different ways as a catalyst, actually, unintentionally in most cases, a catalyst for those developments, and for merging and growing alliances as well. So the way in which the Trump administration has approached Israel and the Palestinians has accelerated some of these processes, some of these developments that I've just been talking about, and it's, one can assume that will continue. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about going forward. The first part, the de facto apartheid state that exists today across all of historic Palestine. Internationally, these positive developments that are still, in some cases, at early stages, but are going in a good direction. And the last part of this book, I try and answer, or at least provide some suggestions for answers to the question, if not a two-state solution, then what? And very much inspired by and owing a lot to the people who have written about this topic before, I argue that all the various attempts that have been made to resolve the question of Palestine through ethnic partition have been a miserable failure, and that a single democratic state offers the possibility of self-determination for all, as well as significant practical benefits, and offers the best framework in which to transform the current discriminatory structures. Now, at the heart of that transformation, and actually at the heart of how I personally started to think about a single democratic state, is the issue of the Palestinian refugees. And I am just going to read a short extract that talks a little bit about that. So my last chapter is called Self-Determination, Not Segregation. When I went to Palestine for the first time in 2003, I broadly understood the Palestinian question in terms of a struggle against military occupation and for statehood. One day, I was speaking with my students after an English class in Dheisheh, a refugee camp in the Bethlehem area, and a student asked rhetorically, "Why can't I go home?" And what I realized then, and my understanding of this truth has only deepened since, is that this question remains in the air, a stark, unanswered challenge, no matter how many efforts are made to smother it. For the State of Israel and the Zionist movement, the return of Palestinian refugees constitutes the undoing of the miracle of the Nakba, an end to the Jewish majority created through displacement and discrimination. Seen outside the lens of this demographic anxiety, however, the power of the Palestinians' return is transformative rather than destructive. It's not that long a book, and it's a short chapter in a not that long a book, so I don't go into too much details, but I try and flesh out a few elements, such as the issue of a democratic constitution, the issue of the Palestinian refugees' return, so on, questions pertaining to self-determination. But what I really hoped to do with the way that the book concludes is offer a glimpse of an alternative reality, I guess, of an alternative and possible future reality in Palestine. And an answer, I guess, of sorts, one answer, to questions like a single democratic state is unfeasible, or, how can you imagine a single democratic state? And I try and make the case for the fact that it's not only feasible, but it's essential. It's essential with respect to natural resources, the religious or cultural landscape of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, population dispersal, and many other angles. So I'm going to finish, hopefully potentially not literally. I'm going to finish my talk right now with how I finished this book, and this is basically the last couple of paragraphs or so of the book. This one state is not so hard to imagine, especially when you travel around that land, as I have done on and off over the last 15 years. As this book has been at pains to describe, a de facto single state already exists, and has for some time. Only it is an apartheid one, defined by harsh boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, whose power structures are shaped by the politics and priorities of settler colonialism. It is a landscape of walls and watchtowers. Yet these visible and concrete divisions can counterintuitively but undeniably speak to and evidence a kind of intimacy, albeit one that has for decades now been of a dark sort, the closeness of a colonizer and colonized, master and slave. And it is precisely in the acknowledgement of this bond, through an unflinching inventory of what Zionism and the State of Israel has meant for the Palestinians, that it is possible to imagine the transformation of the settler and native into citizens. A book which moved me very much when I first read it is Mourid Barghouti's memoir, I Saw Ramallah, based on the poet's return to Palestine after an enforced absence of some 30 years. Quote, "When Palestine is no longer a chain worn with an evening dress, an ornament or a memory or a golden Quran," Barghouti recounts, telling a friend, "when we walk on Palestinian dust and wipe it off our shirt collars and off our shoes, hurrying to conduct our daily affairs, our passing, normal, boring affairs, when we grumble about the heat in Palestine and the dullness of staying there too long, then we will really have come close to it." Later he writes, "The Palestinian has his joys too. He has his pleasures alongside his sorrows. He has the amazing contradictions of life because he is a living creature before being the son of the 8 o'clock news." A single democratic state thus offers something extraordinarily ordinary: the prospect of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians escaping what Edward Said called the iron circle of inhumanity, created by the radical Zionist distinction between privileged Jews in Palestine and unprivileged non-Jews. Moving beyond apartheid, and instead cooperating and arguing, loving and hating, praying and protesting, working and resting, living, in other words, as equal citizens of a shared home.